It was one of those unremarkable afternoons at the end of class when the other students filed out, chatting and laughing, their voices fading into the distance. I gathered my mat, still feeling the calm of our closing meditation lingering like a warm blanket over me. Then, just as I was about to leave, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Could you stay for a moment? I'd like to speak with you." I turned to see Marianne, my yoga instructor, standing by the studio door. She was everything you'd imagine a yoga teacher to be: graceful, composed, and effortlessly serene. At 70, she radiated a warmth and beauty that only deepened with age, a silver glow in her hair, her eyes as sharp and kind as ever. She had a presence that filled the space, making even the simplest request feel inviting. "Of course," I replied, rolling my mat back out and setting my things down. I felt a slight thrill of curiosity. Marianne was usually reserved, focused on class rather than personal interactions. As I walked back to her, she gave me a gentle smile. "I noticed your progress in class. You've really come a long way since you first started." Her compliment, though simple, stirred something within me, a mix of pride and an unexpected warmth at being noticed by her. "Thank you," I replied, feeling a touch of color rise to my cheeks. "It's all thanks to your teaching." She nodded, seemingly pleased with my response, and then paused as if gathering her thoughts. "You know, I sometimes work with students one-on-one after hours, especially those who are really committed to their practice. If you're interested, I think you could benefit from some extra guidance." The offer was tempting. Something in her tone, a warmth beyond the usual, made it feel more than just a routine suggestion. I hesitated, processing the invitation. "I'd love that," I said, excitement bubbling up, though tempered by the slight mystery surrounding her invitation. She gestured toward the back of the studio, where a quiet, candle-lit room was tucked away. "Let's start with some breath work," she said, her voice softer now, carrying a soothing quality I hadn't noticed before. Following her in, I felt the air grow thicker, the space charged with an energy that wasn't there before. I laid my mat beside hers, feeling her presence close beside me. We sat in silence for a few moments, and I tried to focus on my breathing to keep my mind from wandering. But with her there, just inches away, the warmth of her body radiating in the quiet space, I found myself drawn to the subtleties of her movement, the way her fingers spread delicately on her knees, the slow, even rise and fall of her chest. Her voice broke the silence, guiding me into the breathwork. "Close your eyes and follow my rhythm," she murmured. Her voice was so close, lulling me, wrapping me in its warmth. I could feel her hand hovering near my shoulder, and when she placed it there, soft yet grounding, a pulse of something I couldn't quite name shot through me. I let myself sink into the rhythm she set, our breaths sinking, the air thickening with each inhalation. I was aware of her presence in a way I hadn't been before, feeling her warmth not just beside me, but almost as if it were wrapping around me, embracing me in its quiet intensity. As we sat there, her hand slipped to my lower back, guiding me to sit a little straighter. Her touch was gentle, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. A shiver ran down my spine, though I tried to keep my breathing steady. I felt her gaze on me, and when I dared open my eyes, her own were fixed on mine, filled with an intensity that surprised me. "Good," she said softly, and her fingers pressed lightly against my back, adding the smallest amount of pressure, grounding me. Her touch was both a reassurance and a spark, igniting something that I tried and failed to ignore. Her hand withdrew, but the imprint of her touch lingered, a warmth spreading through me. We continued the breathing exercise, and though I tried to focus, I found my mind returning to the feeling of her fingers on my back, the softness of her voice, the quiet way her gaze had lingered on me. When we finally finished, I felt as though I had just woken from a dream. She gave me a small, knowing smile, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder again. "Would you like to continue these sessions?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, barely able to speak, feeling caught in a moment that I didn't want to end. "Good," she said, her voice filled with a warmth that I could feel down to my core. "Then I'll see you again after class tomorrow." As I gathered my things, my mind buzzed with the quiet thrill of anticipation, and I found myself wondering just what else these sessions would hold. The next day I arrived early, eager yet uncertain about what might unfold. I set my things down, my thoughts drifting back to the way Marianne's touch had lingered on my back, her fingers warm, sending an unexpected spark through me. It was a feeling I couldn't quite shake, one that had kept me up the night before, replaying our quiet exchange over and over. Class passed in a blur, each pose feeling like an anticipation for what would come after. As the other students filed out, Marianne caught my eye and gave me that same soft, knowing smile. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded, feeling my pulse quicken as we moved to the private room at the back of the studio. The candles were already lit, casting a gentle, flickering light that softened everything, including the edges of my own uncertainty. "Today, I'd like us to focus on some partner stretches," Marianne said, her voice low and inviting. She positioned herself behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body, her presence steadying yet filled with an unspoken intensity. "Relax and trust me to guide you." I sank into the first stretch, her hands gentle yet firm as she eased my body forward, her touch delicate yet somehow grounding. As she leaned into the stretch with me, her chest lightly pressing against my back, I felt the warmth of her breath close to my neck. My heart raced as I closed my eyes, trying to steady my own breathing, but the closeness of her touch, the softness of her breath, made it impossible. With each new position, she guided me, her hands sliding down my arms, lingering on my shoulders, or pressing lightly against my lower back to help me deepen the stretch. Every touch felt more charged, her fingers seeming to convey something unspoken, her presence so close that I felt enveloped by her energy. As we moved through each stretch, a rhythm developed between us, a quiet, pulsing connection that grew stronger with each touch. When her hands slipped down to my hips to steady me in a lunge, I couldn't suppress the shiver that ran through me. Her fingers lingered a moment, pressing slightly before withdrawing, but the sensation left an imprint, as if she had branded her touch into my skin. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft, her gaze catching mine in the dim light. "Yes," I replied, though my voice came out quieter, almost breathless. Her eyes held mine, and in that gaze there was something deeper, something that felt like an unspoken invitation. "Good," she said, her voice gentle yet with an edge I hadn't noticed before. "Because today we're going to go a bit deeper." She guided me into a seated position and knelt behind me, her legs on either side of mine as she reached around to hold my wrists, guiding my arms into an extended stretch. Her body pressed close to mine, her touch lingering, and I felt the heat of her skin through the fabric of our clothes. Each brush of her fingers, each subtle shift of her position, sent waves of warmth through me, until I felt as though I were melting into her. Her breath was warm against my ear as she guided me, her words barely more than a whisper. "Just breathe," she murmured, her voice so close it felt like a caress. "Feel each part of your body as it relaxes." I obeyed, my senses heightened, every inch of my skin aware of her presence. Her hands slid to my shoulders, her thumbs pressing gently against the tension there, and as I exhaled, I let myself relax into her touch, feeling an unexpected surge of vulnerability. It was a strange, intoxicating feeling, one that left me on the edge of something I couldn't quite name. She seemed to sense the shift in me, her hands lingering on my shoulders, her touch both grounding and electrifying. Then, with a gentleness that made my heart race, she leaned forward, her cheek brushing lightly against mine as her hand slid down to my elbows, guiding me deeper into the stretch. Her touch was soft, lingering, and as she adjusted my posture, her hand rested on my lower back, pressing slightly. A shiver ran through me, and I felt my breath hitch. Her hands withdrew slowly, her fingertips brushing against my skin in a way that felt deliberate, as though she were testing the boundaries of whatever was unfolding between us. "Close your eyes," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "Just let go." I did as she asked, and in that darkness, with only the sound of our breathing and the warmth of her body close to mine, I felt an undeniable pull, something raw and thrilling. She moved in front of me, her gaze steady, her hands resting lightly on my knees. Her fingers traced slow, deliberate circles, each touch leaving a trail of warmth. "There's so much tension here," she said softly, her gaze intense. "Why don't we work on that?" I nodded, unable to speak, feeling the pulse of her fingers against my skin, her touch both calming and electrifying. The intimacy of her presence, her nearness, seemed to dissolve every barrier between us, and as her fingers continued their gentle, soothing motion, I felt myself letting go in a way I hadn't before. With a slow, deliberate movement, she leaned closer, her gaze never leaving mine. Her hand slid up, tracing along my shoulder, her touch lingering as she drew even closer. I felt her breath against my face, warm and steady, and I was captivated, unable to look away, as if caught in a spell. The room felt charged, thick with an unspoken intensity, and when her lips brushed mine, it was the softest of touches, barely there yet filled with a quiet, simmering intensity. I felt my breath hitch, the world narrowing to that single point of contact, that moment that seemed to stretch on forever. When she pulled back, her eyes held mine, filled with a question, a hesitance that surprised me. She waited, giving me a moment to respond, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. I didn't hesitate. I leaned forward, closing the small distance between us, my heart racing as I felt her warmth, her presence, filling every inch of the space around us. Our lips met again, and this time, there was no hesitation, only the quiet intensity of shared understanding, a connection that felt as natural as breathing. As our lips met, the gentle brush deepened, slowly and steadily, each kiss a quiet conversation, every touch a word unspoken. Her hand drifted up to cup my cheek, her fingers gentle as they traced my jawline, drawing me closer. Her presence was magnetic, and I felt myself melting into her touch, letting go of any hesitations, any lingering doubts. Her other hand found my shoulder, her fingers pressing into my skin with a tenderness that sent a ripple of warmth through me. The world outside the studio faded away, leaving just the two of us, cocooned in the soft glow of the candlelight and the charged silence that hung between us. I was acutely aware of the warmth of her skin, the gentle rhythm of her breathing, the softness of her gaze as it met mine. Without a word, she took my hand, guiding me to lie back on the mat, her movements slow and fluid. She settled beside me, her gaze lingering, and in that moment, I felt a profound sense of vulnerability and trust. Her fingers traced gentle patterns on my arm, sending waves of warmth through my skin as her touch grew more deliberate, more intimate. The softness in her eyes spoke of a depth I hadn't seen before, a tenderness that wrapped around me like a gentle embrace. Her hand moved to my cheek again, her thumb brushing lightly over my skin, and I felt a shiver run through me as she leaned down, her lips capturing mine once more. This time, the kiss was deeper, filled with an unspoken promise, a quiet intensity that drew me in and held me close. Her fingers tangled in my hair, her touch a soothing contrast to the pounding of my heart. We stayed like that, entwined in a dance of slow, deliberate touches and lingering kisses, each moment building on the last, creating a connection that felt both exhilarating and comforting. Her hands traced along my arms, my shoulders, her touch light yet filled with a quiet assurance, a confidence that made me feel seen, understood in a way I hadn't felt in years. As our breaths mingled, I felt the barriers between us dissolve completely, leaving only a raw, vulnerable intimacy that was as thrilling as it was terrifying. She held me close, her gaze searching mine, and in that quiet moment, I saw the same uncertainty, the same vulnerability mirrored in her eyes. It was as if we had both stepped into a place we hadn't expected, a space that felt forbidden yet undeniably right. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her hand resting gently on my cheek. I nodded, unable to find the words, feeling my heart race as her fingers continued their gentle caress. I murmured, my voice soft, trembling slightly. Her gaze softened, and she leaned down, her forehead resting against mine as we stayed there, breathing together in the quiet stillness, wrapped in the warmth of the moment. The silence was filled with a shared understanding, a connection that went beyond words, and I felt a surge of gratitude for this unexpected, beautiful encounter. As she pulled back, her hand slipped into mine, her fingers interlocking with mine in a gentle hold. "I don't think I've felt like this in a long time," she admitted, her voice soft, filled with a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "Neither have I replied, squeezing her hand lightly, feeling a warmth bloom in my chest as I looked into her eyes. We sat in silence for a while, letting the moment settle around us, grounding us in the reality of what had just unfolded. There was a quiet peace in her presence, a comfort that made me feel as if I had come home, as if I had come home, as if I had found something I didn't even know I was searching for. As the evening wore on, we stayed close, our fingers still intertwined, sharing soft glances and quiet smiles, wrapped in the warmth of the connection that had bloomed between us. It was a beautiful, fragile moment, one that felt timeless, as if it were held together by something beyond either of us, something delicate and precious. When it was finally time to go, we stood together, her hand still in mine, her gaze lingering as she smiled softly. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet hope that mirrored my own. "Yes," I replied, feeling a surge of anticipation as I looked into her eyes. "I'll be here." She smiled, her fingers giving mine a gentle squeeze before she released me, her touch lingering even after I left the studio, the warmth of her presence following me like a soft glow. That night I lay awake, my mind replaying each moment, each touch, each lingering glance, my heart filled with a quiet joy that I hadn't felt in a long time. The thought of seeing her again, of continuing this delicate, beautiful connection, filled me with a warmth that carried me through the night. The next day, I arrived at the studio with my heart beating a little faster, a subtle thrill humming beneath my calm exterior. The anticipation felt like an electric charge in the air, pulling me toward Marianne and the quiet, intimate world we had begun to create together. As I walked in, she was already there, arranging a few candles in the private room. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, her gaze warm, inviting, and filled with a depth that made my breath catch. She gestured to the mat beside her, and I settled down, feeling the weight of the silence between us, the thick, comfortable kind that didn't need to be filled. She knelt beside me, her fingers brushing lightly over my hand in a familiar, gentle gesture that sent warmth up my arm. "I thought today we'd try something new," she said softly, her voice filled with the same quiet intensity that had woven itself into my thoughts all night. I nodded, words failing me as she moved behind me, her hands gently settling on my shoulders, her fingers pressed lightly, encouraging me to relax, to let go of the tension I didn't realize I was carrying. Each touch was deliberate, lingering just a second longer than necessary, as though she were savoring the feel of our connection just as much as I was. We moved through a series of stretches together, her hands guiding me, her presence so close I could feel the gentle rhythm of her breathing. Each movement seemed to draw us closer, each subtle touch and soft word weaving an invisible thread between us. Her fingers would slide down my arms, her hands brushing over my wrists as she guided me into the next position, her touch both grounding and electrifying. When she guided me into a seated forward bend, her hands pressing gently on my back to deepen the stretch, I felt her body lean forward with mine, her cheek close to mine, her breath warm on my skin. The intimacy of it made my heart race, every nerve in my body attuned to the warmth of her presence, the delicate pressure of her hands, the steady rhythm of her breath. We stayed in that position for a few heartbeats, neither of us moving, as if caught in a moment that felt timeless. Her fingers trailed down my spine, and I felt a shiver course through me, my breath hitching in my throat. I could feel her own breath quicken slightly, her hands lingering on my lower back, her touch gentle yet filled with an intensity that felt almost palpable. Finally, she moved in front of me, her gaze meeting mine, her hands resting lightly on my knees. The room felt charged, the silence between us growing heavier, filled with an unspoken understanding. Her fingers traced gentle circles over my knees, her touch a soothing rhythm that sent waves of warmth through me. "Are you comfortable?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze never leaving mine. "Yes," I replied, my voice soft, filled with a quiet vulnerability that surprised me. Her eyes softened, and she moved closer, her hands sliding to my shoulders as she leaned in, her face inches from mine. I could feel her breath, warm and steady, as she searched my gaze, as if asking for permission without words. My heart raced, and I found myself leaning forward, drawn to her in a way that felt as natural as breathing. Our lips met in a gentle, lingering kiss, the world around us fading as we sank into the warmth and softness of each other. Her hand moved to cup my cheek, her fingers tracing along my jawline, while her other hand slipped to my lower back, pulling me closer. I felt my own hands reaching for her, one slipping to the small of her back, the other finding her hand, interlacing our fingers in a gentle, grounding hold. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, her forehead rested against mine, and I could feel the warmth of her smile. Her hand slipped to my shoulder, her touch gentle, reassuring, grounding me in the reality of the moment. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur, her gaze filled with a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper, feeling the warmth of her hand, the lingering softness of her touch. "More than all right." Her smile deepened, and she took my hand, her fingers interlacing with mine, in a gesture that felt both simple and profound. We sat there, wrapped in the quiet comfort of each other's presence, the world around us fading into the background, leaving only the warmth of her gaze, the softness of her touch, the quiet hum of our connection. In that moment, I realized that whatever this was between us, it was something rare, something beautiful, something I wanted to hold on to nurture, even if it existed only in the quiet intimacy of these stolen moments. She seemed to sense my thoughts, her hand tightening slightly around mine as we sat there in silence, the warmth of her presence filling me with a quiet joy, a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. In the flickering candlelight, with her beside me, I felt as though I had found something I hadn't known I was searching for, a connection that went beyond words, beyond reason, a connection that was as beautiful as it was unexpected. As we sat there, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the moment, I felt a sense of gratitude wash over me, for her, for this connection, for the warmth of her touch and the gentle strength of her presence. It was a moment I knew I would carry with me, a memory that would linger long after the candles had burned out, a reminder of the beauty of unexpected connections, of the quiet magic of shared moments. The days that followed seemed to blur together, each class a prelude to those private, stolen moments that had quickly become the center of my thoughts. The quiet thrill of anticipation that filled me each time I entered the studio was like nothing I had experienced before, a warmth that lingered long after I left, echoing in the solitude of my evenings and coloring my dreams with soft touches and lingering glances. Every session brought a new depth to our connection, a layering of moments that built upon one another, binding us together with an invisible thread of understanding and unspoken promises. Marianne's touch, her gaze, the gentle way she guided me, all of it felt like an unspoken language we were both learning, a silent rhythm that pulsed between us. One evening, as the last of the students left, she turned to me with a soft smile, her hand reaching out to brush my arm in a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. "Let's try something a bit different today," she said, her voice filled with that familiar warmth, her eyes holding a glimmer of something unspoken. I followed her to the back room, the quiet sanctuary we had carved out for ourselves, and settled onto the mat. She knelt beside me, her hand slipping into mine in a gesture that had quickly become our own, a grounding touch that held both warmth and reassurance. Her fingers traced gentle patterns along the back of my hand, each touch sending a ripple of warmth through me, as if she were weaving a spell with each brush of her fingers. "We'll start with some breathing," she murmured, her voice soft, almost a whisper. She leaned close, her hands resting on my shoulders as she guided me into a deep, calming rhythm, her breath mirroring mine, filling the space between us with a quiet, shared intimacy. As I closed my eyes, I felt the familiar warmth of her presence envelop me, the softness of her touch grounding me, her breath a steady rhythm that seemed to sink into my very bones. Her hands moved down my arms, her fingers brushing over my wrists, her touch light yet filled with an intensity that made my heart race. Her voice guided me, soft and steady, a soothing undercurrent to the tension that hummed between us. Each word, each touch, felt like an invitation, a gentle push that urged me to let go, to surrender to the moment. I felt her hand slip to my back, her fingers pressing gently, grounding me as I leaned forward, her touch a steady anchor in the quiet, intimate space we had created. With each breath, each movement, I felt the boundaries between us dissolve, leaving only the warmth of her presence, the softness of her touch, the steady rhythm of our shared breathing. Her hands moved to my shoulders, her fingers tracing gentle patterns along my skin, and I felt myself melting into her touch, surrendering to the quiet magic of the moment. When she leaned in, her cheek brushing against mine, I felt a shiver run through me, a warmth that spread through my body, filling me with a quiet, simmering intensity. Her fingers trailed down my back, each touch a gentle promise, a silent acknowledgement of the connection we had forged. As our breaths mingled, our bodies drawn close in the flickering candlelight, I felt a surge of gratitude, a warmth that filled me, grounding me in the beauty of the moment, the quiet magic of her touch. Her gaze met mine, her eyes soft, filled with a vulnerability that mirrored my own, and I felt my heart race, a quiet thrill that sent a ripple of warmth through me. In that silence, with her hand resting gently on my shoulder, her gaze holding mine, I felt a surge of emotion, a depth of feeling that I hadn't expected. It was a connection that went beyond words, a shared understanding that filled the space between us, a quiet promise that neither of us had spoken but both understood. Her hand slipped to my cheek, her thumb brushing lightly over my skin, and I felt my breath hitch, my heart pounding as her touch lingered, soft yet filled with an intensity that left me breathless. When she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in a gentle, lingering kiss, I felt as though the world had narrowed to that single point of contact, a quiet, beautiful intimacy that held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Each kiss was a slow, deliberate exploration, a gentle weaving of shared moments, each touch a quiet affirmation of the connection we had built. Her fingers tangled in my hair, her touch both soft and grounding, and I felt myself melt into her, our bodies drawing closer, our breaths mingling as we lost ourselves in the quiet beauty of the moment. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads resting together, our breaths mingling in the quiet space between us, I felt a warmth settle over me, a peace that filled every inch of my being. Her hands slipped into mine, her fingers interlocking with mine in a gesture that felt both simple and profound, a quiet promise of the connection we had forged. As we sat there, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence, I felt a deep, abiding gratitude, a quiet joy that filled me, grounding me in the reality of the moment. It was a memory I knew I would carry with me, a reminder of the beauty of unexpected connections, of the quiet magic of shared moments, a connection that was as beautiful as it was unexpected. The studio grew quiet, the candles casting a soft glow over us, as we sat there, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence, a quiet, beautiful connection that felt as natural as breathing. Her hand tightened slightly around mine, her gaze meeting mine, and in that silent exchange I felt a sense of peace, a quiet contentment that filled me, grounding me in the beauty of the moment. It was a memory I knew I would carry with me, a reminder of the beauty of unexpected connections, of the quiet magic of shared moments, a connection that was as beautiful as it was unexpected, and in that silence, with her beside me, I felt as though I had found something I hadn't known I was searching for. The days that followed felt like they were infused with a quiet magic. Each evening, as the rest of the world melted away, Marianne and I would find ourselves wrapped in the intimacy of that studio, lost in the quiet rhythms of shared breathing, lingering touches, and soft whispers. Each session felt like it held a new layer of discovery, both in our movements and in the way we allowed ourselves to sink deeper into the connection unfolding between us. There was an unspoken understanding that grew stronger with each passing moment, a depth that neither of us had anticipated but had come to cherish. We moved together in a flow that was both familiar and thrilling, every glance, every brush of fingers, carrying with it a quiet promise that neither of us dared put into words. One evening, as the sky outside faded to twilight, casting long shadows through the studio windows, Marianne surprised me with a new invitation. She looked at me with a softness in her gaze that made my heart race, her fingers slipping into mine as she spoke. "I thought it might be nice to take our practice outside the studio," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "There's a place I go to sometimes, a quiet spot by the lake. It's peaceful, serene. I thought you might like it." My breath caught at the thought, my mind spinning with the possibilities that such a secluded, beautiful setting might bring. I agreed, and that weekend, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, we met by the edge of the lake. The air was filled with the scent of pine and the soft, rhythmic sounds of the water lapping against the shore, creating a backdrop that felt almost dreamlike. We laid out our mats on the soft grass, surrounded by the quiet beauty of nature, and settled into our familiar rhythm, moving through a series of poses with the lake's gentle waves as our soundtrack. The openness of the space seemed to amplify every sensation, the warmth of the setting sun, the softness of the grass beneath us, and most of all, the quiet thrill of her presence beside me, grounding me in the moment. As we moved through the poses, I found myself drawn to the softness in her gaze, the gentle strength of her movements, the way her presence seemed to blend with the world around us, creating a harmony that felt both beautiful and surreal. When we finished, we sat beside each other, watching the sun sink below the horizon, the colors of the sky reflected in the stillness of the lake. I felt her hand slip into mine, her fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt both simple and profound, a silent acknowledgement of everything we had shared. We stayed like that, wrapped in the quiet, serene beauty of the moment, our breaths sinking with the gentle rhythm of the water, our bodies close, her warmth a steady, comforting presence. As the last light of day faded and the stars began to dot the sky, she turned to me, her gaze filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "Thank you for this," she whispered, her voice soft, filled with an emotion that mirrored my own. "Thank you," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, feeling a surge of gratitude for this moment, for her, for the quiet beauty of the connection we had created. The quiet intimacy of that evening, the warmth of her presence, the gentle rhythm of our shared breathing, it all felt like a dream, a beautiful, delicate memory that I knew would linger long after the stars had faded from the sky. Her hand in mine, her warmth beside me, the quiet beauty of the lake stretching out before us, it was a moment that felt timeless, a memory that I knew I would carry with me, a reminder of the beauty of unexpected connections, of the quiet magic of shared moments. A connection that was as beautiful as it was unexpected. As the night deepened and the world grew quiet around us, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet contentment that filled me, grounding me in the beauty of the moment, in the warmth of her presence, in the quiet, beautiful connection we had built together. When it was finally time to leave, we walked back together, her hand still in mine, her presence a steady, comforting warmth beside me. As we reached the edge of the path, she turned to me, her gaze soft, filled with a tenderness that made my heart race. "Would you like to come back here again?" sometime she asked, her voice filled with a quiet hope that mirrored my own. "Yes," I replied, my voice soft, filled with a warmth that I couldn't quite put into words. "I'd love that." She smiled, her hand giving mine a gentle squeeze, her touch a silent promise, a quiet affirmation of everything we had shared, of the connection that had grown between us in the quiet, intimate moments of our time together. As I watched her walk away, her figure silhouetted against the soft glow of the moonlight, I felt a quiet joy settle over me, a warmth that filled every inch of my being, grounding me in the beauty of the moment, in the quiet magic of shared moments. A connection that was as beautiful as it was unexpected. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind drifted back to the lake, to the warmth of her touch, to the softness in her gaze, and I felt a quiet peace wash over me, a joy that lingered long into the night, filling me with the memory of her, of us, of the quiet, beautiful connection we had created together. The following days passed like a gentle haze, each filled with the anticipation of our next meeting, our next shared moment. It was as though we had carved out a small world of our own, a place where words weren't always needed, where our connection spoke louder than anything we could have said. Marianne and I continued to meet at the studio, our sessions growing more comfortable, yet also more charged with an unspoken intensity. Each breath, each touch, each glance built upon the last, weaving together into something neither of us could easily define, but that felt undeniably powerful. One evening, after a quiet class, she approached me with that familiar warmth in her gaze, her fingers brushing lightly over my arm in a way that had quickly become second nature between us. "Would you like to come to my place for tea?" she asked, her voice soft, yet tinged with a vulnerability that made my heart skip a beat. I nodded, feeling the thrill of the invitation. It was a simple request, but layered with so much meaning, so much anticipation. As we walked to her apartment, the air between us felt electric, each step bringing us closer to something unspoken, something that pulsed with a quiet, simmering energy. Her apartment was warm and inviting, filled with soft light and the faint scent of lavender. Books lined the shelves, their spines worn, each one bearing the marks of someone who had loved and read them deeply. She set a kettle on the stove, her movements graceful and calm, yet I could feel the same quiet tension humming between us, the same anticipation building with each moment that passed. We sat together on her couch, the space between us shrinking as we sipped our tea in silence. Her hand rested on the cushion beside mine, her fingers close enough that they brushed against mine with every small movement, a gentle, teasing touch that sent a ripple of warmth through me. After a few moments, she set her cup down, her gaze meeting mine with a depth that left me breathless. Her hand slipped into mine, her fingers interlacing with mine in that familiar, grounding gesture, and I felt myself leaning toward her, drawn in by the quiet intensity of her presence. Her other hand lifted to my cheek, her thumb brushing lightly over my skin, her touch soft yet filled with an emotion that left me trembling. She leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both gentle and filled with a quiet, simmering intensity. Each touch, each movement felt like an exploration, a dance of unspoken words and shared understanding. As the kiss deepened, her arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, our bodies sinking into each other as though we were two parts of a whole, two halves drawn together by an invisible force. The world outside faded away, leaving only the warmth of her embrace, the softness of her touch, the gentle rhythm of our breaths, mingling in the quiet stillness of her apartment. Our connection, our closeness, felt like a beautiful, fragile secret, a shared moment that belonged only to us. Each touch, each caress, seemed to carry with it a promise, an affirmation of the bond we had built, the quiet beauty of our connection. Her fingers traced gentle patterns along my back, her touch grounding me, filling me with a warmth that I hadn't known I was searching for. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, wrapped in each other's arms, the quiet intimacy of our connection filling the space around us, grounding us in the beauty of the moment. Her hands continued their gentle exploration, her touch both soft and firm, as though she were memorizing every detail, every curve, every inch of me. It was a feeling that left me breathless, filling me with a quiet joy that I couldn't quite put into words. When we finally pulled apart, her gaze met mine, filled with a vulnerability that mirrored my own. Her hand slipped into mine once more, her fingers interlacing with mine in a gesture that felt both simple and profound, a quiet promise of the connection we had built together. In that silence, wrapped in the warmth of her presence, I felt a peace settle over me, a quiet contentment that filled every inch of my being. It was a feeling that I knew I would carry with me, a memory that would linger long after the night had faded, a reminder of the beauty of unexpected connections, of the quiet magic of shared moments, a connection that was as beautiful as it was unexpected. We sat together, our fingers still intertwined, sharing soft glances and gentle touches, the warmth of her presence wrapping around me like a soft blanket, grounding me in the reality of the moment. It was a moment I knew I would cherish, a memory that would linger long into the night, filling me with a quiet joy that I hadn't felt in a long time. When it was finally time to leave, she walked me to the door, her hand lingering on mine, her touch a gentle promise, a silent acknowledgement of everything we had shared. Her gaze met mine, filled with a warmth and tenderness that left me breathless, and I felt my heart race as I looked into her eyes. "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze holding mine in a gentle, unspoken question. "Yes," I replied, my voice soft, filled with a warmth that I couldn't quite put into words. "I'll be here." She smiled, her fingers giving mine a gentle squeeze before she released me, her touch lingering even after I left, the warmth of her presence following me like a soft glow. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind drifted back to her touch, to the warmth of her embrace, to the quiet beauty of our shared connection. I felt a peace wash over me, a joy that lingered long into the night, filling me with the memory of her, of us, of the quiet, beautiful bond we had built together. The next morning, I woke with a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet joy that carried me through the day. Every moment felt tinged with anticipation, with the thought of seeing Marianne again, of feeling that warmth and closeness that we had come to share. It was as if the world had taken on a new color, each step filled with a sense of wonder and quiet happiness. When I arrived at the studio that evening, Marianne was already there, arranging mats and preparing for class. She glanced up when she saw me, her eyes lighting up with that familiar warmth, and I felt my heart quicken, a surge of affection washing over me. We shared a small, knowing smile, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had blossomed between us, a secret that filled the air between us with a subtle thrill. Class passed in a blur, each movement, each pose charged with the quiet promise of what awaited us afterward. As the other students left, I lingered, packing up my things slowly, feeling the anticipation build as the studio emptied. When we were finally alone, Marianne approached me, her gaze holding a softness that made my heart race. "Shall we?" she asked, her voice a gentle murmur. I nodded, And we moved to the private room at the back of the studio, our sanctuary, where the world fell away and left only the warmth of her presence, the quiet intensity of our connection. As we settled onto our mats, the air between us felt charged, the silence filled with unspoken words, with the quiet promise of something beautiful and rare. Marianne guided me through a series of stretches, her touch gentle yet filled with an intensity that left me breathless. Each movement brought us closer, each touch, each glance a silent affirmation of the bond we had created. Her hands lingered on my shoulders, her fingers pressing lightly, grounding me, her touch sending waves of warmth through me. As we moved through the poses, her hands slid down my arms, her touch a gentle caress that left me tingling, my heart racing with each small movement. When she guided me into a seated forward bend, her hands resting on my back, I felt the warmth of her presence behind me, her breath soft against my ear, filling me with a quiet thrill. When we finished, we sat together in the quiet glow of the candles, the world outside forgotten, leaving only the soft warmth of her touch, the gentle rhythm of our breaths mingling in the silence. She took my hand, her fingers interlacing with mine in a gesture that had quickly become a comfort, a grounding touch that held both warmth and reassurance. We shared a soft smile, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had grown between us, a bond that felt as natural as breathing, as comforting as a familiar embrace. Her hand moved to my cheek, her thumb brushing lightly over my skin, her gaze filled with a warmth that left me breathless. In that quiet, intimate space, she leaned in, her lips meeting mine in a kiss that was both gentle and filled with an intensity that left me trembling. Her hand slipped to the back of my neck, her fingers threading through my hair, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened, our bodies drawn together in a quiet, beautiful dance of shared understanding. Each touch, each caress, felt like a quiet affirmation of the connection we had built, a shared promise that filled the space between us with warmth and quiet joy. Her arms wrapped around me, holding me close, grounding me in the beauty of the moment, the quiet magic of our connection. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, her gaze met mine, her eyes filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. Her hand slipped back into mine, her fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt both simple and profound, a quiet promise of the bond we had created. We sat together in silence, our fingers still intertwined, sharing soft glances and gentle touches, the warmth of her presence wrapping around me like a soft blanket, grounding me in the beauty of the moment. It was a memory I knew I would carry with me, a reminder of the beauty of unexpected connections, of the quiet magic of shared moments, a connection that was as beautiful as it was unexpected. As the night grew late, she walked me to the door, her hand lingering on mine, her touch a gentle promise, a silent acknowledgement of everything we had shared. Her gaze met mine, filled with a warmth and tenderness that left me breathless, and I felt my heart race as I looked into her eyes. "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze holding mine in a gentle, unspoken question. "Yes," I replied, my voice soft, filled with a warmth that I couldn't quite put into words. "I'll be here." She smiled, her fingers giving mine a gentle squeeze before she released me, her touch lingering even after I left, the warmth of her presence following me like a soft glow. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind drifted back to her touch, to the warmth of her embrace, to the quiet beauty of our shared connection. I felt a peace wash over me, a joy that lingered long into the night, filling me with the memory of her, of us, of the quiet, beautiful bond we had built together. The next few weeks passed in a quiet rhythm, each day a gentle unfolding of our connection, a weaving together of small, tender moments. Marianne and I continued to meet at the studio, sharing classes that seemed to have taken on a new, unspoken layer. The touches, the glances, the smiles exchanged between us were filled with warmth and familiarity, each gesture carrying with it the quiet promise of our bond. Outside the studio, we began spending time together in simple, quiet ways, walking by the lake at sunset, sharing cups of tea in her cozy apartment, our laughter filling the spaces between us. Each moment spent together felt like adding a stitch to a tapestry, each experience bringing us closer, weaving together a fabric of trust, affection, and understanding. One evening, as we sat in her living room, curled up on the couch with cups of tea, Marianne turned to me with a thoughtful expression. Her fingers brushed over mine, and she smiled, her gaze warm, filled with a depth that made my heart race. "There's something beautiful about this," she murmured, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "About us." I nodded, feeling my chest tighten with emotion. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely audible. "It feels rare." She squeezed my hand, her touch grounding me in the moment, in the quiet beauty of our connection. We sat in silence for a while, our fingers interlaced, letting the quiet settle around us like a soft blanket, a gentle affirmation of everything we had come to mean to each other. That night, as I left her apartment, I felt a warmth settle over me, a quiet joy that lingered long after I had said goodnight. Our bond, our connection, felt like a precious gift, a reminder of the beauty of shared moments, of the quiet magic that had brought us together. But as beautiful as it was, there was a part of me that couldn't ignore the complexity of our relationship, the quiet conflict that lay beneath the surface. The age difference, the societal expectations, it was a reality that loomed at the edge of our connection, a shadow that we both knew was there, but chose not to acknowledge. The weight of it, the uncertainty of where this could lead, left me feeling vulnerable, caught between the beauty of our bond and the complexity of what it meant. As time went on, these quiet conflicts surfaced more often, manifesting in moments of hesitation, of doubt. There were times when I would catch Marianne looking at me with a flicker of sadness in her gaze, as if she too was wrestling with the same questions, the same uncertainty about where this path would lead. One evening, as we sat together in the studio after class, she turned to me, her gaze filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. Her hand slipped into mine, her fingers interlacing with mine in that familiar, grounding gesture. "I need to ask you something," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you truly happy, here with me?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt my breath hitch, my heart pounding as I searched her gaze. "Yes," I replied, my voice filled with a quiet, honest conviction. "Being with you has brought me a joy I can't even put into words." She smiled, her eyes soft, filled with a warmth that made my chest tighten. And yet her voice trailed off, and I saw the flicker of uncertainty, the vulnerability in her gaze. "Do you ever worry about us? About where this might lead?" Her question hung in the air, a delicate thread of doubt woven into the fabric of our connection. I felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of love and fear, as I held her gaze, realizing that this was a conversation we had both avoided, a truth we had both felt but chosen not to speak aloud. Sometimes, I admitted, my voice soft, filled with the weight of everything I had felt but hadn't said. "But I don't want to lose this, whatever it is, however complicated it feels. Too precious." She nodded, her hand tightening around mine, her gaze filled with a quiet understanding. "I feel the same way," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But I worry about what it might mean for us, for you especially. I would never want to hold you back, to keep you from living your life fully." Her words struck a chord deep within me, a fear I hadn't fully acknowledged. It was true, our connection, while beautiful, carried a complexity, a weight that I knew could affect both of us in ways we couldn't yet foresee. And yet, in that moment, all I wanted was her, the quiet comfort of her presence, the warmth of her hand in mine, the beauty of everything we had shared. "I know it's complicated," I replied, my voice filled with quiet resolve. "But what we have, it feels worth it. Marianne, I'm here, and I want to be here." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sadness, and in that silence, I saw the depth of her feelings, the quiet conflict that mirrored my own. Her fingers brushed over mine, her touch a gentle affirmation, a silent acknowledgement of the beauty and the complexity of our bond. We sat together in the quiet intimacy of the studio, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence, our fingers intertwined, our breaths mingling in the silence. It was a moment filled with both peace and uncertainty, a fragile beauty that felt as delicate as a whispered promise. As the evening wore on, we finally rose, our hands still joined, a silent commitment that we would face whatever came next together, that we would hold onto the beauty of our connection, even in the face of uncertainty. When we parted that night, there was a quiet, unspoken understanding between us, a shared acknowledgement of the complexity of our love, of the beauty and the challenges that lay ahead. And yet, as I walked away, I felt a peace settle over me, a quiet joy that reminded me of the strength of our bond, the beauty of everything we had come to mean to each other. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting often on that conversation, on the delicate balance we had struck between the beauty of our connection and the reality of the complications it carried. The time we spent together felt even more precious, each moment a gentle reminder of what we had shared, of the quiet joy that filled every touch, every glance, every word. One evening we decided to return to the lake, our favorite sanctuary outside the studio. The air was warm, the scent of pine and wildflowers filling the atmosphere, and as the sun began its slow descent, casting golden hues across the water, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for this moment, for her presence beside me. We walked along the shore in comfortable silence, our hands occasionally brushing, the warmth of her touch grounding me. As we reached a quiet, secluded spot by the water, she spread out a small blanket, and we settled down, sitting side by side, watching the gentle ripples on the lake's surface. The silence between us was filled with unspoken words, with a shared understanding that felt as natural as breathing. Marianne reached for my hand, her fingers interlocking with mine, her touch a familiar comfort. "You know, I never imagined I would find something like this, especially at this stage of my life," she said, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the water. "It's a gift I never expected." I squeezed her hand, my heart filled with a quiet, tender affection. "Me neither," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, "but I wouldn't change a thing." She turned to me, her eyes filled with warmth and a hint of vulnerability. "Thank you," she murmured, her thumb brushing lightly over my fingers, "for being here, for sharing this with me." Her words held a weight, a depth that left me breathless, and in that moment, I felt a surge of love that was both exhilarating and humbling. I leaned toward her, my hand moving to her cheek, and our lips met in a gentle, lingering kiss, a quiet affirmation of everything we had come to mean to each other. Her hands slipped around my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into her embrace, our bodies drawn together in a slow, tender dance. The world around us faded, leaving only the warmth of her touch, the softness of her breath against my skin, the steady rhythm of our hearts beating in sync. We held each other, wrapped in a quiet, beautiful intimacy that felt timeless, as though this moment had always existed, waiting for us to find it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting soft shadows over the lake, we lay back on the blanket, our fingers still intertwined, watching the stars begin to dot the night sky. The silence between us was filled with a peace that needed no words, a shared understanding that transcended the complexities of life, of time, of the unspoken worries that lingered at the edges of our connection. After a while, she turned to me, her gaze soft, her hand resting gently on my chest. "I don't know what the future holds," she whispered, her voice filled with both hope and uncertainty. "But I know that right now, this is exactly where I want to be." I reached up, my fingers tracing the outline of her hand, feeling a warmth that filled every corner of my being. "Then let's hold on to this," I replied, my voice filled with quiet conviction. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." She smiled, her eyes shining with a mix of joy and vulnerability, and in that moment, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, this connection, this bond, would remain a part of me, a memory that would live on in the quiet corners of my heart. As we lay there beneath the stars, wrapped in each other's warmth, I felt a peace settle over me, a quiet contentment that filled every inch of my being. It was a moment I knew I would carry with me, a memory that would linger long after the stars had faded, a reminder of the beauty of unexpected connections, of the quiet magic of shared moments, a connection that was as beautiful as it was unexpected. When it was time to go, we walked back hand in hand, the night air cool and refreshing, the world around us bathed in moonlight. Her fingers tightened around mine, a gentle squeeze that felt like a silent promise, an acknowledgement of everything we had shared, of the beauty of our bond. At the edge of the path, she turned to me, her gaze filled with a tenderness that made my heart race. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft, filled with emotion, "for everything." I leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead, feeling the warmth of her presence, the quiet strength of our connection. "Thank you, Marianne," I replied, my voice a gentle murmur, "for showing me what this could be." As we parted ways, I watched her walk away, her figure silhouetted against the moonlit sky, and I felt a quiet joy settle over me, a warmth that filled every inch of my being. Our bond, our connection, was something beautiful, something I knew I would cherish, a memory that would linger long after this night had faded, a reminder of the beauty of shared moments, of the quiet magic that had brought us together. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind drifted back to the lake, to the warmth of her touch, to the softness of her gaze, and I felt a peace wash over me, a joy that lingered long into the night, filling me with the memory of her, of us, of the quiet, beautiful bond we had built together.